And so now we're excited to have our next speaker, who needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway, Dr. Jerry Hatfield, who many of you know of with the USDA National Agricultural Laboratory. Used to be the Soil Tilt Lab. So Jerry, tell us what we need to know.
Well, gee. And we'll be done by noon. So we're going to talk about the value of soil today. And because we really don't value soil, and so I think we'll just talk about the underestimation of the value of soil for the next few minutes in all of this. I'm going to take you through many different perspectives of this. We'll talk about all these different pieces. We'll talk about the different dynamics that are going on in all of this and everything. I always put this up, but it's in your handout anyway, that you can get a hold of me and my email address. So in case you have questions afterwards, you can email me, and during the next speaker I can answer that email from you. So, but all of this as we go through this is really important to begin to understand. And I'm going to take you through many different vignettes of how we've been looking at these dynamics. I'm going to start off with this one. And it's good soils equal good yields. And it's a study that we've done across a number of different states. It is an analysis, and each one of those data points represents the average of 50 years of county level data. These are counties coming out of Iowa, there are counties coming out of Kentucky, and there are counties coming out of Nebraska. And it's against what was known as the National Crop Commodity Productivity Index. It's an index that NRCS has in its database. Basically describes the quality of the soil in terms of water holding capacity, a number of different features that go with that. And so just to frame you on this is that an NCCPI index of 0 is a parking lot. And 1 is a really good soil. So it's a value that goes from 0 to 1. And what you see on this is that as that soil index improves, the average county yield goes up. And so you begin to look at this, and you begin to look at the dynamics of this, and then you can ask what's wrong with Nebraska. You know, it's not that Nebraska knows how to grow soybeans any better than Iowa or any other of the I states that are out here. It's the fact that we cherry-picked only irrigated counties. And so if you can supply the water to when that crop needs it during the season, the impact of soil doesn't really make that much difference. But if you're in a rain-fed environment, which the Corn Belt is really a rain-fed environment, the quality of your soil relative to the productivity of that soil has every bit of impact. But what we find is that producers don't really understand the capacity of their soil resource to produce a crop. Because when we begin to look at these index across the individual fields, and we can draw it down on an individual field, and I'll show you one of that in a second, is that they're managing their field as if it's really high quality soil. And they're not getting return on it. And so when we look at this and look at these dynamics and all of this, and there are a number of different counties in Kentucky that if we plotted the deviation among the years on all of that, that actually had 0 county yield because they had a complete crop failure. Because the soil could not supply the water that it took in there. We see the same thing, and this is just corn. You know, good soils, good yields, and all of this in terms of these dynamics. But if you look across the Midwest, this is what that NCCPI looks like on a county level basis. Illinois, Iowa, we're blessed with having really good soils. You move into Minnesota, as we're moving the Corn Belt north, we're not moving the Corn Belt north into really high quality soils. And if you go into Missouri, you're not moving that Corn Belt into really high quality soils. And so we see a lot of variation among years in terms of productivity. And if you look across the Midwest, as we go east into Indiana, Ohio, is that we're moving in and we see a lot of variation among the years just because of the variation of rainfall. And so it really is dependent upon this. But the real bottom line is that what we're really about in agriculture is capturing water and putting it back into that crop to make a yield. And we undervalue that component of the soil resource to do that. Because if we begin to look at this system from an entirely different perspective, we're in the business of converting water to grain. That's really the bottom line when it comes to all this. And so soil becomes very, very important in all of this. And I'll just give you a different example. This is an actual field. This is just west or east of Williams. It's a field that belongs to Iowa State, and we've instrumented it very, very heavily. Those colors on there are the water holding capacity to basically 5 feet. And you look at all this, and that's all in millimeters. It goes all the way from 266 to 327, basically 60 millimeters of difference in terms of water holding capacity within that. And if you look at that, that's really in terms of how we look at the soil variation and this capacity. And so think about this whole water holding capacity is how much money you have in the bank. And you really begin to think about how you convert that bank into yield at the end of the season and all these different dynamics that are going on. So you look at all of this, look at this different piece of that puzzle out there. If you look at that 60 millimeters, that basically is 10 days worth of water. And when we've had a summer like this, that 10 days worth of water availability that allows that crop to grow at the most efficient rate is a lot of yield. And we'll show that perspective as we go along. This is just another example of this. This is a field just north of Dana. This left side is an image that was taken in early August. And this is all with aircraft and satellite, and so we pretty well have a pretty uniform field in the first part of August. This is that same field 3 weeks later. And what we've done is that we have basically removed a lot of that leaf area in that crop because it's wilted, it's dropped off. This is all soybeans. That dark area, that field is 65 bushels, and the light areas are 25 bushels. So we lost 40 bushels to the acre over a 3-week period because it didn't rain. And the soil did not have the capacity to supply the water to that crop. So you can just do the mental piece of that. If you've got 40 bushels to the acre, give you $10 a bushel, that's $400 you lost per acre. Now we start talking about the real value of soil. When we talk about the lost productivity that's out there, you look at the same thing in terms of this, just the cornfield, and I could show you these maps ad nauseum because we all have this, but we really don't utilize our yield monitor maps in the way in which we're really effective in terms of saying, what's that soil resource? What can we do about it? How can we manage it? And how can we put it into different pieces? Those green areas, light part of the fields, and we all see this, variation across the field may go from 300 plus to less than 150 bushels per acre. 150 bushel swing across that because we have variations in soil, and it really is about how much water is available to that crop during the growing season. And so we spent a lot of time looking at this. I've spent my whole career looking at this dynamic of water and how it gets converted into all of this and how we begin to manage it relative to soil resource. And I'm going to introduce you to a concept that I call the concept of efficiency. And the concept of efficiency is really how much input we have on the x-axis and what sort of return do we get on the y-axis. It basically is, you can think about profit as a return. You can think about water use efficiency, light capture efficiency. We've measured a number of different parameters on this. That puts a different dynamic on soil quality because everybody says, well, what's soil really worth? What's soil worth relative to what we want to get out of it? And so we've used this measure of efficiency as a different way of beginning to look at this. And I'll show you a real life example. This is all the data just from one particular field. And this is water use efficiency. This is corn. It's a field that we've been in since 1999. It's just south of Ames. All of those our water use versus yield out there, and those are all in metric units, but it's really the shape of the curve. But what you have in all of this is that you have low water use efficiency. We've invested water into that crop, but we haven't gotten a yield back. Because really this is the dynamic that happens across the Midwest, is that we have very good water supply early in the season. And we have a more variable water supply late in the growing season. That same thing with that soybean field, is that during August is where we see a lot of the field variation, where we see it in corn, is that because in the Midwest, it really takes little water to grow that crop up to tasseling in corn. It takes little water to grow that crop up into full cover of soybeans. And what happens after that is when the water use of that crop really begins to increase, precipitation begins to decrease and become more variable. So you're dependent upon what's stored in the soil profile. And if you don't have the water within that soil profile to support that crop, what happens? Early maturity, reduced grain yield, things like this. Because you cannot deficit spend in the soil water balance. You can't borrow against next year's rainfall. Sorry to tell you that. You're going to live on what's stored right there. And so what we see across fields, in this case here, is that all of this lack of water use efficiency was the fact that we had poor soils. We had a lot of water growth, or a lot of water use, but we didn't get a return on yield because the plant began to die of stress. We see a number of different things that are going on. I'll show you one more example. This is not with water use, this is actually with radiation. This is how efficiently that plant captures radiation in all of this. This is 2010, 11, and 12. And this is how efficiently a soybean crop converted light to grain yield. 2010, we had some of the lowest radiation use efficiencies and lowest yields because we were extremely wet, we were extremely cloudy, we had low radiation. 2011 was much normal. 2012, basically it all plateaued. You had good news and bad news in 2012. Good news is we had lots of sunshine. Bad news is we had no water to use it. And so what we really ended up with was a case in which we really begun to see the difference between good soils and poor soils in 2012. Because if you had really good soils that with deep water holding capacity and everything else, you had some record yields in 2012. The highest yield that we've ever gotten in some of our plots has been in 2012. Because we had adequate water, we had all the sunshine it took to run this whole process, and we achieved 300 bushels. You know, it's pretty dramatic when you start thinking about that. How do we begin to think about the system and all these different perspectives? How do we begin to look at this? And so what we've built is a whole system of saying, how do we manage soils for maximum and water nutrient availability? And because they're the key to optimizing genetic potential. And so what we've been working on is this concept that we call G by E by M, genetics by environment by management. And let me explain it this way. Management is what we oversee. Environment is what we overcome, because what we want to do is optimize the genetics. So it's what we oversee, to overcome, optimize. Because everyone wants to get the full genetic potential that's out there. How do we look at this field in terms of how do we look at this? It becomes part of how we manage that environment. And we think we can't really do much in all of this, but in reality we can. We can begin to understand the dynamics of this overall process. And we can understand the dynamics of really what happens within the soil and how do we begin to draw these pieces together from an entirely different perspective. And so to look at the value of soil from maybe from a little different perspective, we've been looking at a concept that we call yield gaps. And it really is, what's the potential yield relative to what we actually get? And then what's the difference between those? This is Story County soybeans. That dash line up here, that's actual county yields. This solid line across that is a statistically fit line, what we call through the frontier. It's the years in which we didn't think weather had a real major impact on all of this. And that dash line at the bottom is yield gap. And you can see that there are years in which we've had 15 bushels the acre as a yield gap. And you think about that, well, you say 15 bushels the acre. Take that across Story County for the whole year, and the amount of soybeans we produce is a lot of our counties, because of these yield gaps, are losing $40 to $50 million in lost revenue because we couldn't close that yield gap. And why that becomes important is when we begin to look at the next set of analysis that we've done, and this is on corn, is have been looking at the frequency of those yield gaps and how they begin to occur, is that 20% of that yield loss is occurring about 80% of the time. And it's due to what we call short-term stresses. And it's the short-term stresses that are characterized this way. Say we needed 2 inches of water or 2 inches of rainfall a week to recharge that profile up to which that crop wasn't stressed. Well, we only got 1 inch. And so that becomes a short-term stress. Doesn't really get to that point in which that corn is really rolling. It's really suffering out there and say, gee, it's really going to be impacted by water, but it does affect the capability of that grain filling period. And so we see that over and over again. But it becomes the part, that 20% becomes the part that is within that M of the G by E by M. So you say, how do I begin to manage the soils to improve their water holding capacity, improve their infiltration, improve their water storage, because water is money. Every bit of rain, and everybody says, and I've heard producers say that we had $1 million rainfall. Actually, we ought to think about tens of $1 millions for rainfall, or even $1 billion. Because the magnitude of the losses that we see across the Midwest are in the billions of dollars that are lost each year because of lost potential in yield. And we can manage this system from an entirely different perspective when we begin to think about this. So you really begin to track along with me and say, how do we begin to look at this piece of the puzzle? And so we've looked at these yield gaps. This is just all the data for Illinois. We've done it for all the Midwest. As precipitation begins to drop below about 8 inches during July and August, we begin to see yields decrease because we're no longer recharging the profile. We see that. And so really what causes yield gaps are 3 things. That July-August precipitation, July maximum temperatures, August minimum temperatures. Those are the 3 things that cause all of this to happen. Why does this become so important to us, and why do we begin to think about this from an entirely different perspective? And it's because of the climate trends that we're in. This is the long-term projections on climate. This is to 2100, but this is also what's happening right now. Is that we're getting wetter in the winter, we're getting wetter in the spring, and we're becoming more variable with less precipitation during the summer and a little wetter falls. And just think about the implications of that from just one piece, is that we built our agricultural system across the Midwest on reliable summer rainfall. And it's going to become less reliable. The climate trend that we see across Iowa right now is that we have increasing spring precipitation, we have decreasing summer precipitation, and more variable summer precipitation. So if we're going to increase yields on all of this, it really gets down to the point of how do we begin to manage our soils to allow every bit of that water to be utilized to that crop from that standpoint. Here's just the latest Drought Monitor map. Just thought I'd depress everybody. I always get accused of that on my climate talks, is that you know, we have this expanding area of drought across the central part of the Iowa and everything. We're not quite as red as North Dakota and Wyoming, and lots in Montana and lots of places. But we're seeing that, if I could plot, and I didn't show the sequence in the last 3 weeks, is that yellow and brown area. There wasn't a brown area in the 11th. There is a brown area now, which is becoming more severe. And they characterize these as short-term stresses, short-term droughts, less than 6 months. Sorry, we only grow our crop for 3 months. So a 6-month drought really does have a major impact on our productivity. And we're seeing that as we go across these different dynamics. So this just kind of sets the stage for how do we begin to think about this and all of these different pieces. And so what I'm going to do is take you down what we have been doing to our soils. And it's what I call the soil degradation spiral. And that is that as we begin to change our soils out there, and you can put any characterization that you want in terms of poor land management. I have my definitions, you probably have yours, but one of the things that we see when we begin to abuse the soil is the first thing that changes within that soil is that we begin to reduce the aggregate stability of that surface. Those crumbly structure between that hold sand, silt, and clay together is that those begin to degrade. And once those begin to degrade, we see compaction, we see crusting, we see reduced infiltration, we see our water erosion, we see wind erosion, all those other things. Once we begin to erode the soils, we begin to degrade plant growth or reduce plant growth. Once we're no longer having as much plant growth, we're no longer putting as much food into that for the soil biology to work. Yield begins to go down, and all of a sudden productivity. And you see these changes that occur across the field in terms of these low yielding spots, the high yielding spots, and all of this because we've degraded our soils. We've degraded our soils in lots of different ways, but in the biggest case is that we've reduced the capacity of that soil to infiltrate water and store water. That first thing that changes out there, and I can change aggregates within a growing season. Because what we're really talking about is this gateway between the soil and the atmosphere that's this upper ½ inch of soil. And that really governs a lot of things that happen from that perspective. Here's just what's happened to organic matter. These are the moral plots and the Sanborn plots, the long-term plots of plus 100 years. You see in the moral plots, this is on the corn, there's been a continual decrease of organic matter within that soil. Missouri, it's a lot warmer, and the Sanborn plots, organic matter decreased very, very quickly and is labeled off as well. So what we've become very interested in is just really what's happening to organic matter within the soils. How are soils changing out there? And so what we've been doing is actually measuring the carbon fluxes between the soil and the atmosphere on a 12-month basis, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. These data come in at 20 times a second. So we can actually look at the variation between carbon and water fluxes. We've computed the carbon and water balance for corn, soybean, and prairie systems. The bottom line is that on a conventional tilled system in central Iowa is that we're losing about 1,000 pounds of carbon per year. Half a ton of carbon is going back. And that's under what we would consider a properly managed conventional tillage system. We are not going to build organic matter in the way we conventionally manage soils within the Midwest. So anybody that tells you that you can build carbon in the way in which we're traditionally doing things is completely wrong. The only way in which we can build carbon within our soils is to begin to think about how we add diversity to that system, how we add more residue to that system, how do we build a number of different things. And I'll show you how we build soils back up in this. Why this becomes important to us is this right here. Our infiltration rates in soils today are less than an inch an hour. In our conventionally tilled soils, we get an inch of rainfall. We can generally handle that. If we get 2 inches of rain, heavy rain in an hour, we may get an inch into the soil and an inch runs off. These are not uncommon. I've seen runoff out of fields with less than a ½ inch of rain. Because that soil surface, because the aggregates are very, very soft, they decompose very quickly, they shatter very quickly, they clog up all those pores, and so what we see is that we no longer can infiltrate our water. So if you get a 2-inch rainfall, and I asked producers, I said, all right, so you get 2 inches of rainfall, how much is really in that soil? It's not about whether you got 2 inches in the rain gauge, it's rather whether you got 2 inches in the soil. So there's a difference between what's in the rain gauge and what's effective. And so our job in terms of capturing water is how do we put it into that soil. And all of this, and so you begin to see this, and so this is that graph from Hudson's, been around for a long time, showing that there's a difference between soil organic matter and the available water holding capacity. But what I did is I replotted just one of the soils on there, and this is organic matter content, and that's days of available soil water because we know how much water a corn crop uses. It's roughly 6 millimeters of water a day in the real warm days that we have during July and August. So if I assume the average water used by that crop and what it took to maintain that to obtain maximum yields out there, just plotted that relative to this on a 1.5 or 5 foot profile. We go through 2% to 4% organic matter, you're going from about 7 to about 11 days. There's 4 more days of available water that crop transpires at the maximum rate. And if I can keep it transpiring at the maximum rate, I can maximize yields. Water is money, and water in the soil is money in all of this different pieces of the puzzle. What really happens is this is really this whole dynamic of what's going on at the soil surface. So in a low biological activity soil, limited aggregation, very unstable aggregates and all this, and one of the pieces that everybody wants to use for soil health is aggregate stability. It's one of the tests that we use. Is that when we have a low aggregate stability soil, as soon as that water begins to hit that soil, is that it begins to puddle, the aggregates begin to dissolve, they clog all that, and we end up clogging all the pores, and then we end up with runoff. But if we've got a strong aggregate soil, we begin to see that aggregate stays together, water runs through that soil. So really we begin to think about this overall process in terms of how do we begin to look, and that's why I say it's very important on this upper ½ inch of what's going on. It's that surface right there in all that process. So I've taken you through that degradation process. I've taken you down the slippery slide in all of this. Now we're going to build soil back up in terms of this. And so we're going to build soil back up, and it's what I call the soil aggregation climb. It's how do we begin to really build soil. And the first step in this ladder going up is biological activity. We create soil aggregates by promoting biological activity within the soil. I'm sorry, you cannot till your way, and you cannot add material to the soil that creates soil health. So you can't buy another piece of equipment that's going to promote soil health. So all you equipment dealers in the audience, I'm sorry. Well, actually, I'm not sorry. But you're going to have to understand that what we have to do in terms of these dynamics is promote biological activity. And we promote biological activity in the soil with 4 different factors: food, water, air, and shelter. Guess what you want? Food, water, air, and shelter. The 4 basic needs that you have is what biology wants in that. And once we begin to see that we stabilize the biology within the soil, we begin to improve the soil. One of the things that we see is all this organic matter turnover. We see improved nutrient cycling in all of this, is that there's this big coupling between how we're managing biology and how nutrients are recycled. We see improved soil structure. That's the things we can see. This carbon cycling and nutrient cycling are basically invisible processes to it. But what we do see is this improved structure. We see the improved aggregates. We see all this and all these different pieces. And then we see improved water availability. We see parts of that field that no longer were water stressed from that standpoint. Those become the overall dynamics of how do we begin to look at this soil. How do we begin to look at these dynamics from an entirely different perspective. And so building the soil up and all these different pieces becomes very critical. And so when we think about this, everybody says, well, you know, what's residue really do on this soil in all of this? Residue plays lots of different roles. First thing it does is it reduces the energy from raindrops from directly hitting the soil. We don't no longer have raindrops splash. They hit on top of that residue and then filter down through so that we can maintain infiltration rates. If you want the best soil health test that you can find, just go in your field and look after a 2-inch heavy rain. Tell me what the surface looks like. Because if you can't infiltrate 2 inches of rain, you don't have soil health. All the rest is superfluous. Is it really that typifies all the different things that go on? So we got these residue benefits. We modify the temperature, we modify the rainfall, we allow that shelter piece of the biology to work. So we see all this activity working in all this. But when we see bare soils, we see lots of different things. Because here's the other problem that we have in the spring. We have a bare soil surface in a lot of cases. That bare soil surface will reach 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface. It'll be plus 100 at 3 or 4 inches. We basically cook all the biology out of our soil early in the spring. We want these soils to warm up, but we actually make them too hot. And so we basically are causing a lot of our problems, and that's where we see a lot of the aggregation really begin to disappear from this standpoint. Just 2 different pieces on all this, because here's the value that's underestimated. This corn residue laying on the surface is what I call the passive protective blanket. You know, it's not doing anything. The cover crop is an active protective blanket from a physical viewpoint. It basically is the same thing. They absorb all the raindrop energy, allow that infiltration. The difference is that the cover crop is continually supplying food to that microbe. And we see tremendous increases in organic matter when we go to the diverse rotations. We see a number of different things. There's a lot of radiation energy that we lose from the time that corn or soybean crop is mature until the first frost, and from the last frost until we grow that we put it back into cover crops. It basically puts a lot of carbohydrates back into the soil. So we begin to see those different dynamics in all of this. So remember this little piece right here. And think about how that variation, and this is not atypical of what we see for yield variations across the Des Moines lobe in summers like this on yield. So you go back to this and saying, what really is our economic loss? or economic loss in the value of that soil out there. 40 bushels the acre difference. This is only an 80-acre field. Over half of that field is less than 20, or at 25 bushels the acre. 40 times 400, that's a whole lot of money that's lost every year. If we begin to look at this from a different perspective, and these yield gaps and what we begin to see, is that managing our soils to improve them pays us dividends in terms of preserving that yield, but also makes us much more efficient. I'm going to go back to this slide, but it also makes us more efficient in how we utilize our nutrients. When we begin to add the biological activity back to that soil, we begin to cycle nutrients a lot quicker. We see a lot of changes that occurred late in the growing season. We see a lot of the yield increase that comes out of soils that have increased biological activity because of available nutrients late in the growing season. And that's where a lot of our yield increase comes from. We don't change kernel number, we don't change beans per pod, but what we change is grain weight, the weight per kernel, because we plump them out more. Pays us dividends in terms of the dynamics that are going on in terms of this process. So what we really got to do and start thinking about this is that this crop productivity is derived from the soil's ability to supply water and nutrient to that crop. They're really where it comes from and how we manage the system. And we're going to have to think about how we manage this, because it's not only lost yield in terms of productivity, there's another dynamic that go with this. The top two crop insurance claims across the Midwest are excessive moisture and drought. Gee, those can get in the same year. Because what we now, with our rainfall pattern, what do we have? We have drowned out spots we get crop insurance claims on. We got poor parts of that field that we get drought on, that we claim. From 1989 to 2013, across the Midwest, the 8 Midwestern states, the crop insurance payments in those two claims alone in excess of $12 billion. And we could have taken care of that by how we manage our soils. If we'd invested that $12 billion into Neil's comment about how do we really promote conservation, we have an entirely different dynamic of what's going on. We basically rationalize a lot of different dynamics. We rationalize this saying, well, that's the natural field variability that's out there, and we can't do anything about it. You can improve every part of that field. We've been working on how do we begin to improve this. We've been working with producers on how we can do this, and one success story is that we've taken and begin to manage that field, and now we have a yield variation on half-mile rows of less than 10 bushels per acre. Because we've improved all the capacity of that soil to supply water, to supply nutrients across that. His neighbors have that normal yield variation that goes probably 150 bushels plus to minus on the yield monitor. You begin to change these soils very dramatically in all of this. So we begin to see this. Everybody is interested in saying, well, if I put carbon in, what can I get for a carbon market? The value of carbon in soil far outweighs anything that you would ever get from a carbon market. Carbon market, we're talking about maybe $10 a ton. I'm saying if you begin to improve soils within that, you're talking anywhere from $75 to $120 an acre in terms of profit. Always been nervous about that number until I worked with some Indiana producers lately, and I was using the $75 to $100 an acre. And he said, no, you're wrong. You know, I was worried that, you know, he's going to say he completely overestimated. He says, no, I've improved my soils and my average increased profitability is $140 per acre. That's the value of improving the soils and doing the management. Think about that in terms of the dynamics of what goes on, because that is a long-term legacy. That's not a one-year profit, that's sustained profitability over time. The other piece that I'll leave with you is that moving soil is not productive soil. I have a lot of pushback at times saying, well, you know, we got erosion part of the field, we move this part of the field and it's down to the lower part of the field, you know, and it's still really good down here. I'm sorry. Moving soil is non-productive soil. And we see that, and I really think more and more that our tolerable soil loss should be 0. Because as we move nutrients, we move water. Anytime that we're moving that soil, we're reducing the capacity of that water to move into that soil. We see all those different dynamics that are going on. The value of soil, in a lot of cases, is priceless. How do we begin to look at this? How do we begin to look at the dynamics of all of this? Everybody says, well, you know, you can't change organic matter very quickly. Well, yes, you can. We change organic matter very quickly across the upper part of that soil profile. And one of the pieces that we underestimate on the value of soil is not only water, but also the gas exchange, the oxygen and the carbon. Why does corn look yellow in the spring? Is it due to nitrogen? No. It's due to lack of oxygen. Because our soil's puddled, they have anoxic conditions, corn's very susceptible to it. As soon as it begins to dry out a little bit, the corn greens up. We need to really figure out that not only do we deal in the water, but we deal in gases, we deal all these other processes that are going on. And so when we begin to protect that soil surface so that that biology can work, we see big dividends. It's people like Ray, who are living examples of that. There's other producers across the state who have shown this, who understand that we need to farm differently, but farm with a purpose in terms of always preserving that soil so that we utilize whatever we got in terms of water and nutrients back into that crop, because it does pay dividends. When we look across the whole Midwest in terms of what we lose every year because of poor soils and responses to the variation of weather that's out there, it is in the billions of dollars. And we can change that by how we manage our soils. So with that, I'll entertain some questions. I'm sure there's one or two. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that...
Let's get the mic.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned that about 1,000 pounds per acre, or about 1,000 pounds of carbon is lost
Every year.
every year. Per acre? Or per 40 acre? Per acre.
Per acre.
Per acre. How about prairie? How much
Prairie is actually gaining a little bit.
How much in the community?
Yeah, it's gaining in this prairie. This is the Neil Smith prairie. It's gaining about 100 to 200 pounds a year.
Wow.
And the reason that it's not more than that is because it's not a fertilized situation. It's actually nutrient limited. If we would manage our prairies, we could get that up to 500 to 600 pounds very easily in all of this. But because it's nutrient limited, it changes the whole carbon cycle. But it is positive. Jim.
Jerry, from the standpoint of, I know you said we might all have our own opinions, but I appreciate your opinion. If you were to think of 3 management type situations that could be recommended to do the most to improve water retention capabilities as well as building carbon, and I know it's a systems approach, what would be the 3 management systems you'd recommend that we consider in accomplishing both of those?
Pretty simple. If we want to improve carbon, is at first we've got to stabilize that soil, so we've got to keep the residue on the surface. Go to a no-till situation or a strip-till situation, we see the most dynamics there. And in fact, one of the pieces that we've added now is that we now have a direct comparison between a conventional tilled system and a cover crop no-till system with those same flux towers out there. So we can do the carbon balance. This is our first year going into that dynamic, and we've already begun to see that there's changes that are occurring in that. I think we'll see a positive carbon balance both in the soybeans and the corn even this year, just looking at the preliminary data. The other part is that we're going to have to get that continual cover crop on there. I think that cover crops do pay an advantage in all of this. If you don't want to go to cover crops, think about diversifying rotations. Corn, soybeans, wheat, and all of this, we see tremendous impacts when we could put a small grain into this system in terms of the dynamics that are going on in all of this. But what we see in all cases, and I'll go back to the major aspect of all of this, is that we're going to have to reduce our intensity of tillage. Because even with a really good cover crop and all of this, if we go to aggressive tillage, I take all that carbon that was stored by the cover crop and put it right back in the atmosphere. So, you know, it becomes, you get a slight increment, but not very much. And you're not allowing the biology to work. So all of those, I mean, I've got to go to reduce tillage, I've got to keep that residue on the surface to protect that dynamic of the water, and then I've got to add more and more carbon going into that throughout the whole growing season, either with cover crops or diversifying rotations.
I had a follow-up question on the carbon question earlier, the very first one. What was your definition of conventional for the parameters of that analysis?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, conventional, basically, no residue is removed off of that. It basically is could be a chisel plow in the fall. Generally, it's 2 field cultivation in the spring. It's maintaining that 30% residue cover on there, but there's about 2 or 3 tillage operations during the season to prepare the seedbed. There's one over there, and I'll come back to you, Susan.
I think you pretty much answered my question, but what I was kind of looking at the scenario, you've got a clay knob hill. Then, you know, the guy selling you the fertilizer says, we need to put more on there. But that knob hill, even with cover crop on there, your cover crop is never getting thick enough, and the fertilizer isn't doing you any good. I'm assuming you'd be better off investing in cover crop on there of some sort.
Yeah, and in fact, that's often a question that I ask consultants. So you got this, I show them a soils map of the field. You say, all right, you got this organic matter, the low organic matter soils, got all these different, what part of the field did you need to put the most nitrogen on? Invariably, they say, well, you got to put it on these knobs up there because we have low organic matter, and you know, they don't have any mineralization and all this. Don't recognize the fact that water and nitrogen are linked. Those are low yielding spots because they run out of water late in the summer, and so we don't get any return on nitrogen anyway. We've worked with a producer that looked at low yielding fields, high yielding fields, and what we found is low yielding fields were more than 50%, or actually 60% Clarion Canisteo soils, more than knobs within that field. Got him to reduce his nitrogen rates to about 120 pounds. On his higher yielding fields and everything else, we kept it at 150, but no more than that. He's made more money the last 5 years than he ever has.
And Jerry, this is the water quality dimension what you're
Yeah.
talking about, because if we're not putting it on, it's not running on.
And the other piece of this, and that's a good point, Neil, because one of the things we see in those poor areas and where we run our tiles through is that those actually fill up with water earlier in the spring and actually begin to have tile drainage through them. So if we have excess nitrogen, a lot of our components across the field are coming out of those poor parts of the field. They're not coming out of the good parts. And so it exacerbates the whole dynamic of nitrogen leaching as well. So we're not getting return on nitrogen investment. We're limited because of water. All of these things have got to come together to think about this as a puzzle. Susan.
Yeah, I work in the policy arena, so I've got kind of a policy question. And, you know, we're hearing in the Farm Bill that one of the top priorities is to maintain crop insurance support, because that's so critical to farmers. And, you know, certainly we understand that from, you know, needing to have, you know, that economic protection for farmers, because we do have those extreme droughts, and we do have floods, and we have to have a way to keep farmers economically viable. But when you're talking about that 20% drop in yield 80% of the time, you know, how much is crop insurance kind of removing that economic driver, because farmers can, you know, make up for that yield loss with their insurance premiums? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, disclaimer, I don't make policy, but I'll make my opinions known, is that I think we need to restructure our crop insurance program. So if you're not, and I'll tie it back to the piece that Neil was mentioning, is if you don't have the right conservation practices in protecting your soil, in my opinion, your crop insurance premium ought to be much higher than those that have good, efficient conservation practices. If you wreck your car 3 times, what's your car insurance premium, if you can get it? I mean, and if we make our soils more risky, what should our crop insurance premium be? Because you're a risk. You're at that 20% level, and I'm moving you down even more. And so when we start looking at individual fields, it becomes pretty scary in terms of looking at poor fields back to that poor part of the field, a number of different things. You see all this yield variation that's going on, and you look at that, saying, you know, we've added to that risk of that field in all of this. And I really think that there needs to be a big discussion of how do we tie crop insurance really to conservation programs in terms of improving the management. It would have a water quality impact, it would have a soil erosion impact, it would have ecological impacts that we couldn't even imagine yet. But I think, what's that? Oh, and the productivity. I mean, just a return on it would be fantastic. There was a...
Jerry, no, we're out of time. And next year when we have him back, we're having him talk about the connection between these changes in water and our attitudes towards draining. Yeah. Are we taking the water off when we really need it there? But let's thank Jerry.